The old guest ledger lay open on the desk, a name freshly scratched out by a hand that wasn't hers. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, the whispers from the walls growing louder, repeating a name she was starting to know all too well. She wasn't just running a motel. She was living in a tomb, and the dead were starting to get impatient. She had no idea that the key to silencing the whispers and uncovering a 50-year-old secret was hidden just a few feet away, behind the wall of room 3. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The beginning of the end started with a single, worn suitcase lying open on a bed that was no longer hers. Eleanor, or Ellie as she preferred, moved with a forced, mechanical composure, folding a pair of jeans that had seen better days. Her face was a carefully constructed mask, a placid surface she maintained for the benefit of her 10-year-old son, Leo, who watched from the doorway with wide, uncertain eyes that missed nothing. The silence in the house was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket left behind by her husband, Richard. It pooled in the corners of the rooms, clung to the curtains, and filled the cavernous space in the master closet where his suits used to hang. His car was gone from the driveway, and with it the comfortable rhythm of their lives. "Is Dad coming back?" Leo's voice was small, a fragile thing in the oppressive quiet. Ellie's hands stilled on a faded t-shirt. She took a breath, fighting to keep her own voice from cracking. "He needs some time, sweetie," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "For now, it's just you and me. An adventure. An adventure." The word felt like a bitter joke. Her internal monologue was a chaotic storm of shock and betrayal. He had taken almost everything. The joint savings account drained. The credit cards maxed out. His parting note, left on the kitchen counter, was a monument to cowardice, filled with empty platitudes about needing to find himself. He'd left her with a meager amount, a few $1,000s tucked away in a forgotten savings account she'd opened before they were married, an account he'd apparently overlooked in his meticulous financial extraction. Her determination was a fragile, newborn thing, a flickering candle flame born not of courage, but of pure, unadulterated necessity. There was no one else. There was only her, and the small boy in the doorway whose world had just been shattered. Days later, that fragile determination had carried her to a cheap diner 50 miles away, a place where the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and frying grease. She nursed a cup of the bitter brew, a luxury she couldn't really afford, her eyes scanning the classified ads in a smudged local paper. The few $1,000s in her account felt both like a fortune and an insult. It wasn't enough for a deposit on a decent apartment, not in a world that demanded first and last month's rent plus a security deposit. The prospect of a homeless shelter loomed, a dark, terrifying specter at the edge of her thoughts. Her finger traced the columns of tiny, smudged print, past ads for used cars and farm equipment, until it stopped. "For sale, Starlight Motel, Highway 9, as is, inquire with county clerk." The words didn't spark a dream. There were no romantic visions of becoming a plucky innkeeper, no fantasies of a fresh start in a charmingly rustic setting. Instead, the ad presented itself as the only viable option that wasn't a cot in a crowded room. The word motel ignited a tiny, insane flicker of hope in the vast darkness of her despair. A place to live and a place to work all in one. A roof over their heads that she could, in theory, own. It was a desperate gamble, a leap of faith off a crumbling cliff, but it was also a place to start over where no one knew her, where she wouldn't have to see the pity in the eyes of her neighbors or hear the whispers that followed her in the grocery store. She wouldn't be the abandoned wife. She would be the woman who owned the motel. She folded the newspaper, the crinkle of the paper a decisive sound in the diner's drone, and knew what she had to do. The reality of the Starlight Motel was worse than anything her most pessimistic thoughts could have conjured. When she and Leo finally arrived, after a tense meeting with a bored county clerk who seemed all too happy to unload the property, Ellie felt a wave of despair so profound it almost made her physically sick. The sign, a once proud beacon of mid-century optimism, was a skeleton of rusted metal and faded paint. Half the letters of Starlight Motel were missing, and the whole structure hung at a drunken, defeated angle. A dozen or so single-story units formed a U-shape around a central parking lot, their paint peeling in long leprous strips to reveal the graying, weathered wood beneath. Windows were clouded with years of accumulated grime, and the few tattered curtains visible through the filth were a stiff, jaundiced yellow. The parking lot itself was a mosaic of cracked asphalt, with tenacious weeds pushing their way through every fissure. The air, heavy and damp, smelled of dust, old rain, and a deep, profound neglect that seemed to have seeped into the very soil. Ellie's heart sank into her stomach. This was a tomb, not a new beginning. She felt the urge to get back in her sputtering car and just drive, to go anywhere but here. But then she looked at Leo. His eyes, which had been so full of fear and uncertainty for days, now held a flicker of something else. Intrigue. To him, this wasn't a monument to failure. It was a giant, run-down playground, a real-life haunted house waiting to be explored. "Wow," he breathed, a small cloud of vapor in the cool air. "It's huge." Seeing that tiny spark of excitement in her son, that small moment of childhood wonder in the face of overwhelming decay, shored up Ellie's crumbling resolve. She couldn't give up. Not for herself, maybe, but for him. She took a deep, steadying breath, the damp air filling her lungs. She squared her shoulders and walked toward the office, the keys from the county clerk feeling impossibly heavy and cold in her hand, each one a link in a chain she was forging herself. The office, which was to serve as their new home, was a disaster. It was a time capsule of filth and abandonment. But as they began the monumental task of cleaning, something shifted. They worked together, a small, determined team against the overwhelming gloom. Ellie swept away thick cobwebs that hung like funeral shrouds, while Leo, armed with a spray bottle and a roll of paper towels, tackled the grimy windows. It became a bonding experience, their shared effort a tangible force pushing back the darkness and the dirt. A montage of scrubbing, sweeping, and airing out the stale space unfolded. They opened the door and windows, letting the fresh, cool air chase out the smell of mildew and decay. As they worked, they unearthed small, worthless trinkets left behind by the last occupants, ghosts of forgotten lives. A faded postcard from Niagara Falls, a single white die with its pips worn almost smooth, a bent fork tucked away in a dusty corner. Each item was a whisper of a story they would never know. The main desk was a large, imposing piece of dark wood, covered in a thick layer of dust. While clearing its surface, Ellie's fingers brushed against a lockable drawer set deep into its side. After a moment of wrestling with the stiff mechanism, she managed to get it open. Inside, nestled amongst dried-out pens and fossilized paperclips, was a heavy, leather-bound guest ledger. Its cover was embossed with the motel's original name, a name she hadn't known, the Sunset Rest. A pang of annoyance shot through her. She wanted a completely fresh start, a blank slate. This book was a heavy, tangible link to a past she had no interest in, a history of failure that felt too close to her own. Without even opening it, she shoved it back into the deep drawer, turned the key with a decisive click, and pocketed it. "New beginnings," she said, forcing a smile for Leo, who was busy trying to balance the bent fork on his nose. The words felt fragile, but saying them aloud gave them a sliver of power. Their first night in the motel office was unervingly quiet. They had dragged 2 mattresses from one of the less disgusting rooms and laid them on the newly swept floor. The distant, rhythmic hum of cars and trucks on the highway was the only sound, a lonely lullaby in the vast, dark emptiness of the countryside. Ellie lay awake for hours, her mind racing, the events of the past weeks playing on a loop. She was just starting to drift into a restless sleep when a loud, echoing thump jolted her into full, heart-pounding alertness. It sounded like a heavy door slamming shut, a sharp, violent sound that had no place in the stillness of the night. What was that? Leo sat bolt upright, his voice a frightened whisper in the dark. Ellie's blood ran cold. She grabbed the heavy, metal flashlight she'd bought at a gas station, its weight a small comfort in her hand. "Stay here," she whispered, her own voice tight with fear. She slipped out of the office, the cold night air raising goosebumps on her arms. The air was perfectly still. Not a breath of wind stirred the skeletal branches of the nearby trees. She walked the length of the U-shaped building, her flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness. She checked every door. They were all closed, some boarded up, all of them held fast by rust and time. Nothing was out of place. It made no sense. She returned to the office, her heart still thudding against her ribs. "It was just the old building settling, sweetie," she lied, the words feeling clumsy and false. But she didn't believe it, and she knew from the look in his eyes that Leo didn't either. An inexplicable, bone-deep chill followed her back inside, a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. The next morning, the chill was gone, replaced by the mundane reality of their new life. The sun streamed through the now-clean office window, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. Ellie was making coffee on a small hot plate she'd set up on the counter, the familiar smell a small comfort. She turned from the counter, a mug in her hand, and froze. Her breath caught in her throat. There, sitting perfectly in the center of the large wooden desk she had meticulously cleared the night before, was the heavy, leather-bound guest ledger. The drawer she had locked it in was still closed, the key still safely in her pocket. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, terrified drum against her ribs. It was impossible. It was utterly, completely impossible. With hands that trembled so badly she nearly spilled her coffee, she set the mug down and approached the desk as if it were a venomous snake. She reached out a shaking hand and touched the cool leather. It was real. Hesitantly, she opened it. The pages were filled with the elegant, spidery script of decades past, a chronicle of travelers and wanderers. She flipped through the brittle pages, a strange sense of dread building within her. Then she saw them. Several names, in different sections of the book, were violently scratched out with thick, angry strokes of black ink. The pen had dug so deep it had nearly torn through the paper. She looked closer, her blood turning to ice. John Smith, October 26, 1958. Peter Jones, October 26, 1965. Robert Brown, October 26, 1972. Different names, different years, but all on the exact same calendar date. A cold, terrifying dread washed over her, so powerful it made her feel dizzy. She slammed the book shut, the sound echoing in the silent office. Her mind raced, scrambling to find a rational explanation, a logical reason, but there was none. This place wasn't just neglected. It was haunted. The ledger became a fixture, a silent, mocking sentinel on the desk. Every morning, Ellie would wake to find it there, a dark rectangle against the polished wood. Regardless of where she had hidden it the night before, she tried locking it in the trunk of her car, wedging it under a loose floorboard in the closet, even burying it in a shallow hole behind the last motel unit. It made no difference. By dawn, it would be back on the desk, closed, patient, waiting. The nightly thumping of the doors became a familiar, dreaded rhythm, a heartbeat for the motel's restless soul. Soon, another sound joined the chorus, a faint, ethereal weeping that seemed to drift from the walls themselves. A woman's sorrow so profound it seeped into the very air, leaving a residue of grief that clung to Ellie's clothes and hair. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. Ellie walked through her days in a fog of exhaustion, her nerves stretched taut as piano wire. She was jumpy, irritable, and the forced smiles she gave Leo felt increasingly brittle. The fear was a constant, cold knot in her stomach, but something else was beginning to grow alongside it, a hot, stubborn spike of frustrated curiosity. This wasn't just happening to her, it was an assault, a puzzle thrown at her feet, and a part of her, the part that had refused to crumble when Richard left, was getting angry. She was tired of being afraid. She was tired of hiding from a book. One morning, after a particularly rough night where the weeping had been louder than ever, she stared at the ledger on the desk and made a decision. If she couldn't get rid of it, she would understand it. She would meet this haunting head-on. Armed with a fresh pot of coffee and a grim sense of purpose, she retrieved a cheap calendar and a pen from a bag of school supplies she'd bought for Leo. She sat down at the desk, opened the heavy book, and began to work. Her fear was still there, a cold presence at her back, but it was now overshadowed by a clinical resolve. She would treat it like a problem to be solved, an accounting error to be reconciled. She turned the brittle pages, her fingers tracing the elegant, looping script of the past. The names and dates swam before her tired eyes, a river of transient lives. She focused only on the desecrated entries, the names obliterated by angry black ink. With methodical precision, she documented each one. "John Smith," she whispered to herself, the sound loud in the quiet room. She wrote it down in her notebook. October 26th, 1958. She flipped forward through the years, the rustle of the old paper like the shedding of dry skin. Peter Jones, October 26th, 1965. Her pen scratched across her own notepad. Robert Brown, October 26th, 1972. The pattern was undeniable, a stark, repeating anomaly in the otherwise mundane record of the motel's history. Different names, different years, but always the exact same date. October 26th. She finally reached the last one, the entry from 1978. The scratching here was the most violent, a furious black scar that had torn through the page, leaving a jagged wound in the paper beneath. The ghost, or whatever it was, wasn't just haunting, it was commemorating. It was holding a vigil. Ellie stared at the date on her calendar, a profound chill running through her that had nothing to do with her lack of sleep. The haunting wasn't random. It was an anniversary. While Ellie became increasingly obsessed with the ledger's grim arithmetic, Leo, driven by a boy's boundless capacity for adventure, had begun his own, more physical exploration of their strange new kingdom. Ellie had forbidden him from going inside any of the abandoned rooms, a rule he had, for the most part, respected. But the door to room 3 was different. It was slightly ajar, a dark sliver of an invitation that his curiosity found impossible to resist. One afternoon, while Ellie was poring over her notes, he slipped away and crept toward it. He pushed the door open, and it groaned in protest. The air that wafted out was thick and heavy, a foul cocktail of mold, damp, and something else, something faintly metallic and deeply sorrowful, like old, dried tears. A single, tattered curtain, bleached to a pale gray by decades of sun, hung askew, allowing a thin sliver of dusty light to penetrate the gloom. The room was in a state of advanced decay, the wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips, the mattress on the bed frame stained and sunken. It felt different from the other rooms he'd peeked into, felt sadder. Playing the part of a great explorer discovering a lost tomb, Leo began to inspect the room. He ran his hands along the damp, bubbled walls, his sneakers crunching on fallen plaster. He made his way to the small, dark closet at the back of the room. It was empty, save for a single rusted wire hanger. He ran his hands along the cheap, dark wood paneling of the back wall, imagining he might find a secret switch or a hidden lever. To his astonishment, his fingers met a section that gave way slightly under his pressure. His heart gave a little jump. It was a loose panel barely held in place. His explorer fantasy suddenly felt very real. Forgetting his mother's warnings, his curiosity completely overtaking his fear, he wedged his small fingers into the gap and pulled. With a low groan of splintering wood, the panel came away, revealing a small, dark crawl space, a black square of the unknown. Leo fumbled for the small phone Ellie had given him for emergencies, his hands shaking with a mixture of fear and excitement. He switched on its flashlight, the bright LED beam cutting a stark white circle into the darkness. He peered inside. The space was tight, filled with cobwebs and the smell of dry rot. And there, tucked away in a far corner, was a small, rusted metal box, the size of an old cash box or a child's lunch pail. "Treasure," he breathed, the word a reverent whisper. He had to squeeze his shoulders into the opening to reach it, his fingers straining to get a grip on the corroded metal. It was heavier than it looked. He struggled to pull it out, his excitement a palpable electric force. Finally, with a grunt, he dragged it free from its hiding place. He scrambled back out of the closet, clutching his prize, and ran as fast as he could back to the office, his sneakers pounding a triumphant rhythm on the cracked pavement. He burst through the door, his face flushed and his eyes shining. "Mom! Mom! Look what I found! It's treasure!" Ellie looked up from the ledger, her face a mask of annoyance at the sudden intrusion. The anger was immediate, hot and sharp. He had disobeyed her, gone into one of the rooms. She could see the dust and cobwebs on his shirt. She opened her mouth to scold him, but the words died in her throat as her eyes fell on the rusted, mud-caked box he held out to her. It was old, ancient-looking, and it seemed to radiate a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Her anger evaporated, replaced by a chilling, unwelcome premonition. That box was not filled with treasure. It was heavy with secrets, and she had a terrible feeling they were the same secrets that had been keeping her awake at night. They placed the box on the office desk, right next to the open ledger. It seemed to belong there. The lock was a solid mass of rust, completely fused shut. Ellie found a screwdriver in a toolbox Richard had left behind, its presence a small, ironic twist of the knife. She worked the tip of the screwdriver into the seam of the lid, Leo leaning in close, his earlier excitement now tempered by his mother's somber mood. Ellie put her weight into it, and with a jarring, high-pitched screech of protesting metal, the lid popped open. The air that escaped from the box smelled of old paper and time itself. Inside, miraculously preserved from the damp and decay, was a small collection of yellowed newspaper clippings, folded neatly. The paper was so brittle it looked like it might turn to dust at the slightest touch. With a surgeon's care, Ellie lifted the top clipping and unfolded it. The paper crackled in the quiet room. Her eyes fell on the headline, and the air rushed from her lungs. Local girl, Sarah Jenkins, missing. The date on the article was November 2nd, 1978. Her hands trembling, Ellie laid out all the clippings on the desk, creating a mosaic of a forgotten tragedy. They told the story of a 17-year-old girl who had vanished without a trace. One article featured a grainy, black-and-white photograph of her. She was smiling, her hair long, her eyes bright and full of a life that had been cut short. Another article, a follow-up from a week later, mentioned the date she was last seen by her family after an argument. It was October 26th, the same date, the date from the ledger. Ellie felt a wave of dizziness as the pieces began to slam into place. The articles mentioned the innkeeper at the time, a Mr. Abernathy, who owned and operated the Sunset Rest. He was questioned by police, but claimed the girl had never been a guest. He had an alibi, a supposed supply run to a neighboring town, and with no evidence of foul play on the premises, the police had moved on. The case quickly went cold. Another sad story relegated to the back pages before disappearing entirely. Ellie stared at the smiling face of Sarah Jenkins, and a profound, aching connection formed in her heart. This was no longer a ghost story. This was a murder mystery, and the victim was right here, her presence woven into the very fabric of the motel. The whispers, the thumping doors, the weeping, it was all her. It was Sarah. Ellie's own feelings of abandonment and vulnerability paled in comparison to what this girl must have faced. A new feeling began to displace the fear, a powerful, protective sense of purpose. Her hands were steady now as she turned back to the guest ledger. She was no longer a haunted victim, she was an investigator. She flipped with newfound confidence to the entries for the last week of October, 1978. Her eyes scanned the list of names registered that week, a snapshot of ordinary lives intersecting with a hidden horror. There was a truck driver from Ohio, a traveling salesman peddling encyclopedias, a young couple on a belated honeymoon. And then she saw it. The last entry for the night of October 26th. The name that had been scratched out with such a desperate, violent fury that the paper beneath was torn. The name was Eliza Gray. Ellie stared at the name, and in a flash of chilling insight, she understood everything. It was a pseudonym. Sarah Jenkins, a scared 17-year-old girl running away from a fight with her parents, had checked into the Sunset Rest Motel under a false name. The box of clippings wasn't a killer's trophy. It wasn't hidden by Abernathy to cover his tracks. It was hidden by someone who knew the truth, or at least suspected it, someone who was too scared to come forward but couldn't live with doing nothing. Maybe the truck driver or another guest who had heard something that night. They had left a breadcrumb trail, a time capsule of truth, hoping that one day, someone would find it. The ghost of Sarah Jenkins wasn't just haunting the motel. She was pointing. She was pointing to the ledger, to the room, to the evidence. She was begging for her story to be told, for her real name to be spoken once more. The morning after the discovery, the motel felt different. The oppressive weight that had settled in Ellie's bones from the moment she'd first seen the derelict sign seemed to have lessened. Not gone, but changed. The whispers and thumps were still there, faint murmurs in the bones of the building, but they no longer sounded like a threat. They sounded like a plea, a desperate, lonely echo reaching out across the decades. Ellie stood at the clean office window, a mug of coffee warming her hands, and looked out at the dew-covered asphalt. She felt a powerful, unexpected wave of empathy for Sarah Jenkins. She, too, knew what it was like to be alone, to be erased, to have your life stolen out from under you by a man you thought you could trust. Her own fight for survival now felt inextricably linked with finding justice for this lost girl. The ghost wasn't a monster to be vanquished. She was a partner to be helped. A plan began to form, clear and sharp in the morning light, cutting through the fog of her exhaustion. She turned from the window as Leo stirred on his mattress, his hair a messy tangle, his face soft with sleep. "Morning adventurer," she said, her voice lighter than it had been in weeks. "I have a mission for us today. We're going on a field trip." Leo sat up, rubbing his eyes. "A field trip? To where?" "The creepy woods." Ellie managed a genuine smile. "Even better. We're going to the town library. We're going to be detectives." His eyes lit up. "Like in the movies?" "Exactly like in the movies," she confirmed. She went to the desk and began to gather the evidence. She handled the brittle newspaper clippings with a newfound reverence, placing them carefully inside a large manila envelope. She took her notebook, where she had transcribed the scratched-out names and the timeline of October 26th, and placed it beside the envelope. She looked at the heavy guest ledger, still sitting on the desk, but decided against taking it. It was too conspicuous, too heavy with its own strange energy. For now, her notes would have to be enough. She packed a small bag for them with water bottles and a few snacks, the simple, maternal act a grounding force amidst the strangeness of their new reality. Her purpose was a shield, and for the first time since Richard had left, she felt like she was walking toward something, not just running away. The town library was a solid brick building, a bastion of quiet order that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic decay of the Starlight Motel. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and dust, a scent Ellie found deeply comforting. A friendly, older librarian with a cascade of white hair pinned up in a loose bun and glasses perched on the end of her nose looked up from her desk as they entered. "Well, hello there," she said warmly. "What can I help you two with today?" "We were hoping to look at some old newspapers," Ellie explained, feeling a slight tremor of nervousness. "From the late 1970s. The librarian's eyes twinkled with interest. "An historical project? My favorite kind. We have everything on microfiche. Come, I'll show you how to use the reader. It can be a bit cantankerous." Her name was Mrs. Gable, and as she led them to a clunky beige machine in a quiet corner, she chatted amiably. When Ellie mentioned the year, 1978, the librarian paused. 1978, she mused, a flicker of memory in her eyes. That was the year that poor girl went missing out on Highway 9. Sarah Jenkins. Caused quite a stir, it did. I was just a teenager then, but I remember everyone talking about it. Such a tragedy. They never found her. Ellie's heart gave a lurch. "That's actually the case we're looking into," she said, trying to keep her voice even. Mrs. Gable's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she simply nodded, her expression becoming more serious. "Well, you've come to the right place. The archives are thorough." She showed Ellie how to thread the spools of film into the reader, how to turn the crank to scroll through the ghostly, glowing green pages of the past. The whir and click of the machine was a mechanical heartbeat as Ellie and Leo journeyed back in time. Leo was fascinated for the first 10 minutes, but his attention soon waned, and he settled on the floor with a picture book Mrs. Gable had given him. Ellie, however, was completely absorbed. She scrolled past articles about local politics, harvest festivals, and high school football games, her eyes scanning for any mention of Sarah Jenkins or the Sunset Rest. She found the initial articles she already had, but then she found more. Deeper, more detailed reports from the weeks following the disappearance. And then she found it, a small article tucked away at the bottom of a page, an interview with a long-haul trucker who had been staying at the motel that night. His name was Frank Miller, a name that matched one of the non-obliterated entries in the ledger for that fateful week. The article quoted his statement to the police. He reported being woken late at night by the sound of a heated argument outside, a girl's raised voice and a man's angry shouts. He'd looked out his window and seen a young woman, who he assumed was the girl from the argument, arguing with the innkeeper, Abernathy, near the office. The police report, quoted in the paper, noted that when questioned, Abernathy had readily admitted to the argument. He claimed the girl was a teenage runaway he had found hitchhiking, that he was trying to convince her to let him call her parents, and that she had refused, storming off on foot down the highway into the night. He had seemed concerned, helpful even. The trucker's company had reassigned him to a cross-country route the very next day, and according to the article, he was never questioned again. The other guests who had been registered that night had already checked out and were either unreachable or, when contacted, claimed they had seen and heard nothing. It was Abernathy's word against a ghost. Ellie's hands clenched. Abernathy's story was too neat, too clean. He had painted himself as a good Samaritan to cover a monstrous crime. The ghost of Sarah Jenkins wasn't just a whisper in the walls. She was a witness whose testimony had been silenced. The articles about Sarah's disappearance mentioned her grieving family, her parents, Harold and Mary Jenkins, and a younger sister, Judith. A quick search on the library's public access computers revealed that her parents had passed away over a decade ago. That left Judith. Finding a woman named Judith Jenkins after more than 40 years felt like an impossible task. She could be married, her name changed. She could have moved anywhere in the world. But she was the only thread Ellie had, the only living link to the dead girl who was now her constant companion. This became the new focus. The task was daunting, a search for a needle in a global haystack. Ellie started with the library's databases, searching for Judith Jenkins. Then she started guessing. She tried cross-referencing the name with locations mentioned in the old articles, towns where other relatives had lived. Hours bled into one another. The initial excitement of the investigation gave way to the frustrating, tedious reality of detective work. Leo, having exhausted the library's supply of picture books, grew restless. He came over to her computer, peering at the screen. "Are you finding the bad guy?" he asked. "I'm trying to find the girl's sister," Ellie explained, her eyes tired from staring at the screen. "Her name is Judith." "Judith," Leo repeated, testing the name. He pulled up a chair next to her. "I can help. I can read the names." And so they became a team. Ellie would type in a search query, and Leo would help her scan the results, his small finger tracing the lines of text on the screen as he slowly read names and dates aloud. Most were dead ends, women who were the wrong age, who lived in the wrong state. But working together, the tediousness felt less overwhelming. Ellie felt a surge of pride and love for her son, for his resilience and his unwavering belief that they were on a grand adventure. Her own fear, the cold, creeping dread that had been her shadow for weeks, was almost entirely gone now. It had been burned away by the hot flame of adrenaline and a fierce, protective instinct that she hadn't known she possessed. She felt Sarah's presence, not as a cold spot in the room, but as a quiet encouragement at her shoulder, a silent partner in their search. She was no longer just Ellie, the abandoned wife. She was Sarah's advocate, her champion. She would not let her down. After several hours that felt like days, after countless dead ends and false leads, Ellie was ready to give up for the day. Her eyes were burning, and Leo was starting to fall asleep in his chair. She decided to try one last, desperate search. She typed Harold and Mary Jenkins obituary into the search bar. A result popped up, an online memorial page from a funeral home in a neighboring county. She clicked on it. She read through the loving tribute to Sarah's mother, Mary, who had passed away in 2012. And then she saw it, a line near the end that made her heart stop. She is survived by her beloved daughter, Judith Peterson. Judith Peterson, a married name. Ellie's fingers flew across the keyboard. It was still a common name, but the location, the age, it was all starting to line up. With a few more clicks, she found it. A Judith Peterson, age 62, living in a small town called Northwood, 3 hours away. The pieces fit. With more digging, a frantic, heart-pounding search through an online directory, she found a phone number. The number stared back at her from the screen, a string of 10 digits that felt as heavy as a tombstone. Ellie stared at it for a long, silent minute. Her hand trembled as she reached for her cell phone. This was it. The culmination of the whispers, the ledger, the hidden box, the hours of research. It all came down to this one phone call. What could she possibly say? How do you call a stranger after nearly 50 years of silence and tell them you think you found their murdered sister's ghost? How do you explain that you live in the place that has held her pain for all that time? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic echo of the night she'd first heard the doors thumping in the dark. She took a deep breath, the dusty air of the library filling her lungs, and pressed the numbers into her phone. The phone rang 4 times, each ring stretching into an eternity. Ellie was about to hang up when a voice answered, thin and cautious, the frail, papery voice of an elderly woman. Hello. Ellie's own voice was tight, her throat suddenly dry. Hello. Is this Judith Peterson? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Yes? Who is this? My name is Eleanor Vance, Ellie began, the words feeling clumsy and strange. This is going to sound very strange, but I believe I own the property where the Sunset Rest Motel used to be on Highway 9. The silence that followed was absolute. A vast, empty space filled with unspoken history and pain. Ellie could hear the woman's faint, shallow breathing. She waited, her own breath held tight in her chest. Finally, Judith spoke again, her voice sharper now, edged with a lifetime of carefully guarded grief. That was a long time ago. There's nothing left to find. I think there is, Ellie said, her voice soft but firm. She had to do this for Sarah. I found something here. Something that I think belonged to your sister, Sarah. What could you possibly have found? Judith's voice was brittle, defensive, the sound of an old wound being prodded. I found a box of newspaper clippings about her, hidden in the wall of one of the rooms, Ellie said, pressing on. And a guest ledger. Her name, a name I think was hers, is in it. The motel. It's not a quiet place, Judith. I think she's still here. I think she wants you to have the ledger. The only response was a sharp, choked intake of breath, followed by a sound that was half sob, half gasp. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of grief held back for decades finally cracking through the surface. Judith was silent for a full minute, a silence thick with tears and the ghosts of half a century. Ellie waited, her own eyes filling with tears, her heart aching for this woman she had never met. Finally, Judith spoke, her voice thick and wet, but clear and resolved. I'll be there tomorrow. A modest, older car, a pale blue sedan, pulled slowly into the cracked parking lot, its engine noise a foreign sound in the quiet afternoon. It stopped near the office, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's side door opened, and an elderly woman emerged, moving with the slow, deliberate care of someone for whom every step is a negotiation with pain. She leaned heavily on a dark wooden cane, but her eyes, when she lifted her head, were sharp and piercing. They took in every detail of the dilapidated motel, the peeling paint, the grimy windows, the drunken lean of the sign. Her gaze lingered on the door to room 3, and a flicker of profound, ancient pain crossed her features, a shadow that seemed to deepen the lines around her eyes. This was not a visit, it was a pilgrimage to a place of trauma. Ellie watched from the office window, her heart aching for the woman. She and Leo stepped outside as Judith made her way toward them, her cane tapping a soft, rhythmic beat on the broken asphalt. They greeted her gently, not with effusive sympathy, but with a quiet, respectful presence. Ellie introduced herself and Leo, and led Judith into the now clean but still humble office. Judith paused in the doorway, her eyes scanning the small space, her nostrils flaring slightly as if testing the air. "He lived in here," she said, her voice raspy with disuse and memory. "Abernathy. It smells different now. We've tried to clean it up," Ellie said softly. "I'm so sorry to bring you back to this place." Judith's sharp eyes met hers, and for the first time, Ellie saw not just pain, but a flicker of fierce strength. "You didn't bring me back," Judith said, her voice gaining a measure of firmness. "I never really left." Inside, Ellie had placed the rusted metal box and the heavy guest ledger on the center of the desk. They sat there like artifacts in a museum, objects imbued with a power and a history that far outweighed their simple forms. In a soft, even voice, Ellie explained everything: the ledger's mysterious appearances, the nightly sounds, the discovery of the box in the wall of room 3, and the terrible pattern of October 26th. She left nothing out, feeling that this story, in all its strangeness, belonged to Judith now. When she was finished, she slid the heavy leather ledger across the polished wood of the desk until it rested in front of the older woman. The moment Judith's trembling, wrinkled hand touched the cool leather cover of the book, a profound change occurred. It was not a dramatic, violent event. There was no sudden gust of wind or slamming of doors. It was quieter, more fundamental. A long, low sigh seemed to move through the entire building, a sound that was less heard and more felt, like a breath held for 50 years was finally, shudderingly, released. The oppressive weight in the air, the constant, low, level hum of anxiety that Ellie had grown so accustomed to she barely noticed it anymore, simply vanished. The air in the office felt lighter, cleaner. Sunlight, streaming through the window that Leo had scrubbed so diligently, seemed to suddenly grow warmer, more golden, chasing the last of the cold shadows from the corners of the room. Leo, who had been standing quietly by his mother's side, let out a small gasp and looked around, his eyes wide with wonder. Even he could feel the difference. The haunting was over. Tears streamed down Judith's face, silent and steady, as she opened the ledger. She did not need to search. Her hands, guided by an instinct that transcended time, opened the book directly to the page from October 1978. Her gnarled finger, the nail clouded with age, traced the violent, angry black scratches that obliterated a name. "Eliza Gray," she whispered, her voice choked with a fresh wave of grief. The tears fell onto the page, blurring the names of the other guests, but the scratched, out name remained, a testament to a desperate, final act of self-preservation. "She loved the name Eliza," Judith whispered, looking up at Ellie, her eyes swimming with sorrow and a strange, sad kind of gratitude. "She was always reading novels. She said if she ever ran away to start a new life, she'd call herself Eliza Gray." She thought it sounded romantic. Sitting there in the quiet, peaceful office, with the afternoon sun warming the room, Judith told them the whole story. Her voice, weak at first, grew stronger as she spoke, as if giving voice to the truth after so many years of silence was a source of strength in itself. She recounted the fight Sarah had with their parents. It had been a stupid argument, the kind of explosive, dramatic fight that only a 17-year-old and her worried parents could have, an argument over a curfew, a boy, a future that seemed both terrifyingly close and impossibly far away. Sarah, fiery and proud, had stormed out of the house, not to run away forever, but just to cool down, to walk until the anger had burned itself out. Her walk had led her down the dark ribbon of Highway 9, and the glowing light of the Sunset Rest Motel had seemed like a safe harbor. Abernathy, the innkeeper, had seemed kind at first. Judith's voice grew tight with a 50-year-old rage. He had seen a young, upset girl, alone and vulnerable, and had put on a mask of fatherly concern. He offered her a room for the night at a discount, telling her she could call her parents in the morning when everyone had calmed down. Sarah, trusting and naive, had accepted. But later that night, the mask had slipped. He came to her room, his kindness replaced by a darkness, a predatory hunger that had terrified her. Sarah had fought back, Judith's voice filled with a fierce pride. She was strong, my Sarah. She was not a victim. She had fought him, scratching and kicking, and had managed to break free, to run from the room out into the cold night air of the parking lot. But he had caught her. He was bigger, stronger, and in his panic that she would go to the police, that his dark secret would be exposed, he had silenced her. He had killed her right there, in the shadow of the motel sign. Then, in a cold, calculated act of self-preservation, he had hidden her body, dumping her into an old, unused well at the far end of the motel property, a place overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. He had intimidated the few other guests who had heard the commotion. The trucker, Frank, had been the only one who had seemed suspicious, but Abernathy had fed him the story about a runaway, and with Frank's route changing the next day, the police had never had a chance to question him further. And the clippings? Ellie asked softly. Judith looked at the rusted box. I've thought about that for years, she said. The police report said the trucker's statement was the only one that mentioned an argument. I think he knew something was wrong. I think Abernathy's story didn't sit right with him. I think he came back, maybe weeks later, and hid that box in the wall. He was probably too scared to go to the police again. They hadn't listened the first time. But he couldn't just let it go. He left it there, a message in a bottle, hoping someone, someday, would find it. She looked at the scratched out name in the ledger. And this, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper again. This was Sarah. Year after year, on the anniversary of her death, her spirit was here, trying to scratch away the false name he had trapped her under, trying to claw her way back to her own identity, trying to tell someone who she was. With Ellie's help, her hand steady on Judith's as she held the phone, they called the local sheriff's department. At first, the dispatcher was skeptical. A cold case from nearly 50 years ago, reopened by a ghost story and an old woman's grief. But Judith was resolute. She had the ledger. She had a witness account passed down through the whispers in the walls. And she had a location. An official investigation was reluctantly reopened. When the forensics team, guided by Judith's memory of the property layout from her own childhood visits, uncovered the old, capped well at the far end of the property, they found exactly what she had told them they would find. Sarah Jenkins was finally coming home. She was given a proper burial, a small, quiet ceremony under a gray autumn sky. She was laid to rest in the family plot, next to the parents who had died never knowing what had happened to their daughter. At the graveside, Judith, her face etched with a sorrow that was finally allowed to be public, turned to Ellie and wrapped her in a fierce, tearful hug. The hug was full of gratitude, of a shared understanding between two women who had, in their own ways, been brought to their knees by life and had found the strength to stand up again. You gave her back her name, Judith sobbed into Ellie's shoulder. You gave us all peace. The motel was different after that. The silence that fell over it was no longer unnerving or oppressive. It was a peaceful, comforting quiet, the sound of a place at rest. The whispers were gone. The thumping doors were still. The weeping had ceased. The ghost of Sarah Jenkins had finally found her peace, and in doing so, had given peace to the place that had been her tomb for so long. The final scene is set in the crisp air of the following autumn, a year after Ellie and Leo had first arrived. The Starlight Motel was transformed, resurrected. Using the story of the motel's haunting, which had become a local legend, and her own fierce determination, Ellie had managed to secure a small business loan. The sign was the first thing she had fixed. It was now freshly painted, its elegant script glowing in a warm, welcoming white neon against the dark country sky. Each of the 12 rooms had a fresh coat of paint, cheerful blues and yellows, with clean, crisp sheets on the beds and a welcoming yellow porch light above each door. The parking lot was newly paved, smooth and black, and on this particular evening, it was nearly full of cars and semi-trucks, a testament to the motel's rebirth. Ellie stood behind the counter of the bustling, brightly lit office. She was no longer the haunted, hollowed-out woman who had arrived here a year ago. Her face was fuller, her eyes bright with confidence and a warmth that seemed to radiate from her. She was in charge not just of the motel, but of her own life. A large, weary-looking trucker came in, shaking the road dust from his jacket. "Evening, Ellie," he grumbled, a tired smile on his face. Ellie's own smile was genuine and warm. "Welcome to the Starlight, Frank," she said, her voice clear and bright. "Got your usual room, number 7, ready for you. The quiet one at the end." The trucker's face softened. "You always remember, Ellie," he said, his voice full of gruff affection. "That's why we keep coming back. You make a man feel like he's come home." After Frank had gone to his room, Ellie stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. Leo came out and stood beside her, no longer a small, frightened boy, but a confident 11-year-old who knew how to check in a guest and change a flat tire. Together, they stood in the cool night air, looking at the full parking lot and the glowing sign that cast a hopeful light onto the highway. The light from the office spilled out onto the pavement, a beacon of warmth and safety on the dark, lonely road. Ellie looked at the life she had built, a life born from betrayal and desperation, nurtured by whispers in the walls, and finally brought into the light by an act of compassion. She had not only resurrected a forgotten motel and solved a decades-old murder, she had resurrected herself. She had built a new life for herself and her son, a life of purpose, community, and a deep, abiding peace. The starlight was shining again.